Hello, everyone, and welcome to this latest program from the Brandywine Museum of Art and its Wyeth Study Center. My name is William Coleman. I'm a Wyeth Foundation Curator and Director of the Andrew and Betsy Wyeth Study Center. My colleague Melissa Reckner from the Brandywine Conservancy is on the line. I'll tell you more about her expertise and background in just a moment. We're excited to share one more program about this great exhibition we've had on view in Chadds Ford for the past few months before it closes in just a few weeks. Every Leaf and Twig, Andrew Wyeth's Botanical Imagination closes on September 15th. So this is kind of the last hurrah and a chance to dive deeper on this exhibition that really clarifies how this unique organization works, both a conservancy and a museum of art. And this shows what's possible in that unique structure, consulting with experts in conservation and environmental education across the state of Pennsylvania to get a really new insight into these works of art by Andrew Wyeth. I can share both that this exhibition will travel to one more venue, the Bruce Museum in Greenwich, Connecticut, opening September 3rd, and that will bring together both the Maine and Pennsylvania parts of this project. And I'll also tease what's coming next in the Andrew Wyeth Gallery at the Brandywine Museum of Art, which is called Up East, Andrew Wyeth in Maine. This is another collection exhibition drawn from the collection of the Wyeth Foundation for American Art. And it's a wonderful overview of the other half of this creative life, the summers in Maine, that may be somewhat less familiar to the Pennsylvania audience. Without further ado, we should dive into this project in particular, and I'll just give you a little bit of background. This is an exhibition about Andrew Wyeth's kind of portraits of plant life. Some of you may have attended the earlier program that was just the curatorial perspective from yours truly on this exhibition, just the art historical side. But what's really special about this project is the way it brought to bear the conservation perspective from people like Melissa Reckner, who was an important contributor to our interpretation of the exhibition. Melissa and colleagues in the Brandywine Conservancy were adding their own reflections on what they see in these incredible works of art by Andrew Wyeth, most of which have never been exhibited before. Glorious botanical watercolors that give you a sense of this artist walking the Chadds Ford landscape and returning to these specimens of plant life over the seasons, over the cycles of the natural world. This much we knew as art historians, and what I've learned from this is what was significant about many of the plant specimens that called out to Andrew Wyeth, what they tell us about an ecosystem, and it has certainly made me see the world around us differently, and I hope you'll take away some interesting insights from this as well. Melissa Reckner joins us from Western Pennsylvania. Not every Brandywine Museum fan may know that there is a remote outpost of the Brandywine Conservancy and Museum of Art called Penguin Court, not far from Pittsburgh. Melissa is a lifelong resident of Somerset County, and she has a career spent in restoring life to streams that were degraded by abandoned mine drainage out in that part of the state with such a rich history of mining. And she is an environmental educator, and she has been working with the Brandywine as program manager at this place called Penguin Court that you'll be hearing about for 6 years, and she coordinates events on the property for the Brandywine out there. So she helps also with our native plant sales and developing partnerships, and also with land stewardship. So it's been a priority for our organization to show how all this fits together, this really unique organizational structure, a museum at the heart of a conservancy. And I hope you'll see the proof in the pudding here today. Melissa reminded me that the Conservancy came first, and the Conservancy was founded in 1967 before the museum in 1971. So both go way back, and we've learned a lot from this collaboration. Maybe to dive deeper and let Melissa start saying something and not just me, I will share my screen and go on to the next slide after this one. I'll just give you a sense of what you're looking at here. The cover of this book, which accompanied the exhibition, designed by the great Jenny Chan. This has unfortunately sold out, but we really appreciate the broad public interest in it. The Bruce Museum will be doing a reprint of that catalog when it goes to Connecticut. it. So if you're really eager to snap up a hard copy, you might try their museum store in a few weeks. And at left is one of the great images from the Wyeth Foundation archive that we manage in the Wyeth Study Center of Andrew Wyeth studying the natural world in Chad's Ford. So you'll be seeing more of that. Let us go on to our first image. And I would love to pass the mic to Melissa to tell us a bit about what we're looking at here.
Certainly. Well, this was a fine opportunity to introduce Penguin Court to a lot of our audience this evening, because I think a lot of people still don't realize that, yes, Brandywine has a presence in Westmoreland County in Western Pennsylvania. The two photos on the left demonstrate the landscape of Penguin Court, which used to belong to the Scaife family. Richard Mellon Scaife gifted it to the Brandywine Conservancy in the year 2015 to be conserved primarily for its wildlife value. And as you can see, we have a glorious conservatory on the grounds that I do programming in. We have a greenhouse that's a separate structure where we grow a lot of native plants that we offer for sale. Then closer to home for many of you in the eastern part of the state, that lower right photo will probably pull at your heartstrings, because that was the impact of Hurricane Ida about 2 years ago on the Brandywine, and also connects widely to the landscape and the trees and the plants that are illustrated in Wyeth's paintings. And that photo at the top there is the laurels, which is a beloved preserve of the Brandywines. So Brandywine Conservancy is involved in land conservation because, of course, that protects the water. We have a municipal assistance program. We're working on a flood study that should be revealed pretty soon to see how we can mitigate the impacts of some of these surging waters that we're seeing more of. Certainly native plant cells harken to a lot of our hearts, and education is a key part of the Conservancy's work as well.
Absolutely. And I would just mention that lower right image was a key context for this exhibition. And there's a kind of a wider development in the museum profession and the scholarly study of art history that has been called eco-criticism, which is thinking about events like these, changes in the natural world and how art relates to them, what we can learn about the fragile rhythms of the world we inhabit by looking at it through the lens of artists past and present. And we've been really finding it rewarding to look at that landscape in the lower right through the eyes of Andrew Wyeth, this really sensitive inhabitant of that landscape who was documenting and responding to many of the trees you see in that image, and experiencing regular flooding in a floodplain there in his own home just up the way. And I should mention that the Conservancy is an important part of thinking about the future of that property as well, called Brinton's Mill. They advise municipal governments in our wider Brandywine Valley, but they also advise us on the museum side about future preservation efforts. So it's a real privilege to be able to talk with people like Melissa and get out of our own heads, get out of just the art and museum perspective, and think about how this whole ecosystem fits together. So I wanted to share also an image of the other side of all of this. And you may not have known that Brandywine had a Western Pennsylvania presence. You may not know that Brandywine also has a Maine presence. And we have our other Wyeth Study Center, our collection care and research facility in a space on the campus of the Farnsworth Art Museum in Rockland, Maine, where full-time Brandywine employees are working on this Brandywine managed collection. And this exhibition, I wanted to underline, began there. In another changing landscape at right, you see dramatic sea surface temperature changes in the Gulf of Maine, where ocean waters are warming faster than 99% of global ocean water. So it's a change that's being felt immediately. It's not hypothetical. It's not future worries. It's already happening in Maine. And so we look at images like the one on the left of Andrew Wyeth, this inhabitant of these twin ecosystems that he came to know with unusual focus, living with a narrowly circumscribed part of the natural world and coming to know its constituent pieces really deeply. And we think about that water out behind him there and how it's been changing. So all of that is in the background of this exhibition. We're asking some questions that more and more museums are asking of works of art, and there have been some really hopeful threads. We see an example in that practice there, walking in the landscape, living with it, that might be inspiring for us in the future. And I've come away from these objects that we're going to share with you today, noticing things I never noticed before as I drive down to Chad's Ford in the daily commute, as I walk this landscape. So hopefully you'll pick up on some of that too. So the first image we wanted to talk about, and what we'll kind of structure our conversation today around some key objects in the exhibition, Every Leaf and Twig, that clarify how these two ways of looking come together. So I'll kick it off. What the art historian sees in something like this is a great example of one of the masters of the medium of watercolor, one of those received wisdom pieces about Andrew Wyeth is that he's the heir to Winslow Homer in the American watercolor tradition, that he's a real virtuoso in depicting water with water itself and those subtle shifting light effects and shadows of leaves on water. So that would be enough. And this would be enough as just a great example of an early watercolor by Andrew Wyeth from this remarkable formerly family collection that has been entrusted to the management of the Brandywine through Betsy James Wyeth's estate plan. But we can go even deeper. And Melissa and others in the Conservancy have helped me to do just that. So what do you see in this image?
Sure, the conservationist of me sees a beautiful sycamore tree, which always makes me smile because a sycamore is pretty iconic for its peeling, camouflaged bark, but it has such a white base that it sticks out like a sore thumb. And they are water-loving plants. I always say they like to have wet feet. So anytime you see a sycamore, you can assume that there's going to be a water source nearby. And of course, this is a very iconic sycamore tree that is often photographed at the Brandywine, as you can see here in this image. Sycamore trees used to be huge trees before the settling of America. It was not uncommon for a sycamore to be 10 feet in diameter. And you think about the size of some of the rooms in your home, they're probably 10 feet across. And imagine having a tree of that size that often did become hollow in the middle from the heartwood being rotted out. And it was not unheard of for people to actually live in those trees as their home.
Incredible. Yeah, we encourage people to do what I did just earlier today and walk up the Brandywine Trail, just up from the Brandywine parking lot, and see if you can spot this incredible tree. There are a few spots right outside the museum itself where the river curves such that you can see it from long distance, but even better to get up close with it. And this is what we love to see. There were people out there today enjoying this preserved landscape and having a little picnic out there, sometimes even swimming in the creek there. So it remains. This is one of those things that Andrew Wyeth depicted that you can't miss in the Chad's Ford landscape. It's such a dramatic feature with that precarious lean out over the creek, but it has held on, it has endured, it is resilient against rising waters, as you've heard, and hopefully will remain for many years to come. This exhibition also featured tree subjects that have not endured or were lost only very recently, and one of those I'll call out in case you get a chance to come in to see the show. We have a never before exhibited watercolor called Dryad Study, as well as the that came out of it, Dryad, both currently on view. As we understand it, that dryad tree, that hollowed out tree, and the way Melissa was describing, only just came down in January of this year in a storm. So changes are happening around us all the time. Andrew Wyeth captured this landscape through his eyes, kind of preserved it in amber, not as a scientist, not as an environmental educator, but as an artist, and took some license with that. But it's really interesting to look through his eyes and see what he saw. I should also mention, please do put any questions you might have in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. I believe the chat function has been enabled. Feel free to chip in with comments and observations, say where you're tuning in from and all that good stuff. And we will certainly have time for questions at the end. Let's go on to our next work of art, Giant Jack Study of 1968. I'll just explain the kind of system you're seeing here. This is a number that's very important to us in Wyeth world. That is the Betsy cataloging system. Betsy James Wyeth, who kind of formed and documented this collection. Andrew Wyeth's creative partner and manager, really crucial part of the operation, was carefully documenting what he made. And even when we do have these large format watercolors that have never been exhibited before, we have a lot of documentation about them. They were preserved under the highest standards of care, everything cataloged really precisely. So it's made our work a lot easier. So here too, the art historian hat on, we see a really bold and modern and stark watercolor, really dark and black. And it's been interesting thinking about this subject matter. Andrew Wyeth's zooming in rather than zooming out on individual specimens of plant life across the two states, because the color palette is really different in some cases. You get a lot more color in the blue-green summer in Maine, especially in his very early work. But then you get this mid-career austerity, dark inky blackness and browns, kind of limiting the materials at his disposal as one of the core parts of his project. But we also look at this through the lens of what we know from the archive was Andrew Wyeth's very serious interest in contemporary abstraction. And I think this has been revelatory for many. We might think of this beloved painter who is best known for working realistically as almost conservative or opposed to painterly modernism and pricklier styles coming out of the big city. And nothing could have been farther from the case. I look at this, I see Franz Klein, I see Jackson Pollock, I see these artists who he really admired in many instances coming out in these bold gestures, kind of improvising on this large sheet of paper before our very eyes. Talking with folks in the Conservancy, we can go even deeper and think about what he was responding to here. So what would you say about this, Melissa?
Well, sure, you make me smile of the artist that you're naming. And me, I see deep, dark, rich, organic woods because Jack in the Pulpits are shade-loving plants. So they, of course, grow where there's rich humus, good, thick soils, and their size is really indicative of the soil health around them. I smile because this is called the giant jack study, when in fact we're looking at a Jill plant. Jack in the pulpit are one of those unique plants that can actually change its sex from year to year, depending on the health of the ecosystem around it, and that helps us out as conservationists. So if we see male plants versus female plants, we kind of get a clue as to what's going on, and that's called diphasic sex expression. The point is, when there's a lot of nutrients in the soil, of course, that can help fuel a female plant because it takes a lot of energy. No matter if you're a mammal or a plant, it takes so much energy to produce offspring and reproduce. And so a female plant needs these big dual set of leaves to capture as much sunlight as possible, pulling more nutrients from the soil so that it can produce seeds, which will be seen later in the season. About this time of year, if you go out, that pulpit will be gone, but rather you'll see, it will be replaced by a series of first green, then orange, then red berries. And when they're red, you know they're ripe and they could be harvested if you were going to transplant them. But it's really a good indicator of soil quality. Male plants, of course, don't need to reproduce, so they're typically smaller and they only usually have one set of leaves.
So maybe we should see the thing itself here. Melissa kindly provided these images so we can all be on the lookout for this. Anything you'd want to call out in these photographs?
When you were speaking about perspective, this is certainly a plant that it behooves you to squat down or get on your knees to look at, because from above, you miss the beauty that's really on the inside of the plant. And that one photo on the right shows how it's like a tunnel leading you to the spadix there in the middle, which is, of course, the preacher at his pulpit, the spade around him. And it's easy to walk past this when you're in the woods. So I appreciate that Andrew Wyeth slowed down. It was John Muir who said we really ought to saunter and not hike in the woods. So you can slow down and take in all these little scenes of beauty.
I think it's really useful to see these photographs also because you get a sense of the choices the artist is making. Even if he does make a fairly faithful representation of the plant, you see what he's leaving out. And even if, as Melissa says, this is a plant that likes the shade, so inky darkness is not altogether unexpected, we see just the sheer complexity of the forest floor. He's leaving out all these fallen leaves, all the other plant life around it, all the little things it's sheltering below, and it gives us this thing almost in a spotlit black studio isolated from its context. We go back to it, little hints of that complexity down below, but does take that poetic leap to make it a kind of self-sufficient subject. So yeah, the question, I guess, is would our eye be drawn to that subject in the same way? We are getting a sense of a really unusual eye living with this landscape and honing in on these quieter features of it, not known for great sweeping sublime landscapes or something, but these quiet intimate details of the natural world, and then certainly applying many of them to the significant works in tempera and watercolor that he's best known for. Mostly what we're seeing in this exhibition are what we might call studies, and we really want to celebrate that stage of the process, seeing the creative process, seeing how the ideas take shape. But it's also interesting to go between these and quote unquote finish works in tempera or exhibition watercolors, and see how we might use that smaller detail to make a larger composite. Let's go on to the next. So Frog Hunter Study, another of these previously unexhibited watercolors in the show. You're learning to read the system here, and I hope you'll just think about what that number means. These are really astonishingly large. If any of us have ever messed around with watercolor a little bit, and maybe we even have some serious artists on the line here, that is a pretty unusual scale for a watercolor. So he's working quickly in these really imposing sheets of paper, taken off a roll, cut to size, and then working quickly to capture this watery environment. We happen to know exactly where this is. It's not so far from the Brandywine. It's a familiar landscape in Chad's Ford, but he makes it kind of universal. These shimmering reflections. I love this little gesture, the ink fading away as the big fat wet brush loses its pigment and fades to nothingness there in the water, and that classic gesture of the watercolor master using white itself, the unpainted white of the paper, to give you the reflection of the sky in the water. So a glorious thing. It's so rewarding to stand in the presence of these things, as we are lucky to do in the Wyeth Study Center. Pull out these drawers, pull out these racks, and just see literally thousands of these things in the 7,000 object Andrew and Betsy Wyeth collection, from which we'll keep on drawing more and more great stories to tell. But here too, when we look at it through the lens of the Brandywine Conservancy, we see another layer to the story. So what would you say, Melissa?
Well, this scene makes me think of late winter, early spring. It kind of has a coldness to it, but also a warmth with those browns. And I just really love that he captured red-winged blackbird in that one barren shrub, because to me, those are one of the best signs of spring. Red-winged blackbirds migrate to South America. A lot of robins are often used as that first sign of spring, but many, unbeknownst to people, do hang out in North America, in our part of the country, year round as long as they can find food. But a red-winged blackbird will not. And the fact that it's present just gives me, hope that spring's around the corner.
And it might be interesting to look at an example of an environment like this one. As I understand it, this is actually on the grounds of Penguin Court, right?
We have a pond on the property, and so this is the edge of the pond. Wetlands, as is portrayed in that image, are really important transition zones between land and water. I think sometimes wetlands get a bad rap and people think that they're mosquito breeding grounds or some nonsense, but they really are very diverse communities. You're looking at a wetland if water is present for an extended period of time during normal precipitation. This year has been really dry for us. So, things that normally exhibit that are absent, but flooding, of course, makes you think maybe you have a wetland, but you have to look for other components, including the presence of hydrophytes, which are water-loving plants like cattails that you see here, or rushes and reeds that were in the previous image. Also, you look for hydric soils, which basically mean there's a lack of oxygen because of the water saturation. But I just really think more attention needs to be given to wetlands, especially in our changing climate, because they serve such essential functions, from capturing and slowing water from storm events and allowing it to act like a sponge immediately and then slowly release those waters back into the groundwater table. It lessens flood damage. It can help filter solids and sediments out of the water to act as a purifier and essentially clean the water. They serve as a nursery grounds, especially now that it's migration season. A lot of things from north are moving south, and they use wetlands as layovers for rest and fuel. And I think, like I said, they just need to be given a little more respect.
It's really interesting to hear you reflect on that, the possibility of misunderstanding an environment like this one as wasteland. It makes me think again with art historian hat on about a deeper history in Western art of artists who did hone in on those natural subjects that others might have seen as wetland. Any historian of American art is instantly thinking of the artist who comes to mind, Martin Johnson Heade, who's a name worth Googling if he doesn't mean anything to you, Heade. And what you'll see in your Google image search is a lot of these really interesting images of salt marshes near Newburyport, Massachusetts. And there's a whole fascinating history there of this kind of fringe economy of marsh grass collection and lands that other people were targeting for development. And we see in Heade, we see in Wyeth, these artists who saw what others could not see and saw a landscape that had its own unique colors, textures, light, all those artistic values, and maybe also picked up on those less obvious values for a sustainable ecosystem, that ability to stabilize the rush of floodwaters and all that you've said. So I know the Conservancy is working for to advocate for wetlands in our immediate Chadds Ford area, where the stakes are incredibly high, as we saw from that flood photo. As part of their larger flood mitigation efforts in the region, as part of that Brandywine flood study that Melissa mentioned. Our next image, Skunk Cabbage. You're getting to know this way of making these large format sheets, again, nearly 30 inches wide, where he hones in on that striking little specimen. Again, never been on a museum wall before, carefully documented by Betsy Wyeth. We're very fortunate that it's been passed down to us so that it can now have its moment on the wall, and we can take this stage in his process seriously. You see in the title Betsy Wyeth gave to it, fourth version, that he was responding to this plant many different times. I think we have 2 different skunk cabbage works in just this exhibition. There are more where that came from. Something about this plant called out to him repeatedly, and it'd be interesting to reflect through the eyes of the Conservancy on what that might be.
Well, it could have been the smell, because skunk cabbage is very appropriately named. It's certainly, if you would break any part of the plant, it has that odor that's reminiscent of a skunk, but it is a wetland plant, so you only find it in such soils. And what's neat about this plant is it's one of the first to emerge in the winter. It grows and actually produces heat. And so it has the ability to melt the snow around it. And if you would forward to the next slide, you would see the images of what skunk cabbage looks like as it's emerging out of the ground, that mahogany, burgundy, sometimes green splotched space is the hood. And inside of it is a petalless flower. Skunk cabbage evolved before butterflies and bees, and so it has that color to look like rotting meat, and it has that funky smell to attract not our beautiful butterflies and bees, but rather flies and beetles, because those are its primary pollinators. And so the heat can help volatilize the scent to lure them in. And it's the National Wildlife Federation said that the plant can produce as much as 15 degrees of heat. And so it can be upwards of 70 degrees inside that structure, which is a perfect respite and refuge for insects on a cold winter's day. Also, what's neat about skunk cabbage is as the plant ages, the roots actually pull it deeper into the ground. So they're really hard to even try to transplant. And then you can see as the season progresses, it gets these big green leafy cabbage-like leaves that are really water rich. The plant in its early stages is an important source of food for bears as they're coming out of their hibernation. And then, of course, those leaves get bigger and bigger as the season progresses, providing shade and shelter to a lot of amphibians and reptiles. And then because they are so water rich, come fall this time of the year, they're going to disintegrate pretty quickly, and you'll never know they're there until late winter.
That's fascinating. So what I hear and what Melissa has just shared is some of the reasons why this particular specimen of the plant life of the Chadsford region might have called out to Andrew Wyeth when he is painting late and early in the season. He's, I guess it's especially in the early side, early spring. This is one of the first things to come out. He's got that flash of color calling to your eye and a very brown, bare landscape. Then you do get these glorious leaves and their shimmering light and texture, the sound they might make that call out to you. So maybe we get some sense about just why this plant gets the honor of it kind of close up by Andrew Wyeth on so many occasions. So it's really helpful. So we're trying to put ourselves in the shoes of this artist that many of us know and love already. We might know him for things like Christina's World, these great sweeping temperas that zoom far out beyond the individual specimen, and it can be a bit of a leap to get from something like those, Night Sleeper, Snow Hill, the latter two currently on view at the Brandywine, to I'll go back. It's just Skunk Cabbage fourth version. How does that fit into the same creative life? And we can sort of imagine that process of being out walking, always looking, slow looking, immersed in this landscape, and being inspired by that feisty little plant that's able to warm up the soil around it and create a little bit of a sanctuary. That's astonishing. 15 degrees. Think about that. I hadn't understood it was that degree of warmth, but really is able to make some change in the environment around it. And provide a respite, as Melissa said, for other plants. So fascinating. As I understand it, this adaptation may come to be a little bit less essential in the future as the environment warms.
Well, sure, that's the evolutionarily biologists are going to have to study and see if this plant will have the need to produce heat, because if our winters are not nearly as cold as they used to be, maybe it's not necessary. And the plants that don't have that adjustment will, maybe they won't thrive in our warming climate.
Mm-hmm.
I also loved on the image that it almost looked like that was a sycamore tree that the skunk cabbage is at the base of. There's some brushstrokes in there that have the lighter tones, and that cavity, like it's perfectly nested. So shelter in two forms.
Yeah, it could be interesting. I'll share next just a few more images here we wanted to raise up for you. Low limb, first version, another that he comes back to multiple times. We see that kind of extreme example of the coloristic austerity I referred to earlier, basically just brown and black. Little bits of some ochre showing through, but really limiting the tools at his disposal. Yes, those of us who live and work in this ecosystem know that November, December without snow in Chad's Ford is fairly monochrome, but it's not like this. This is a really a celebration of brown, an immersion in that pigment, and again, isolating these trees from their surrounding context. We've seen some of those the photographs that Melissa shared. We understand the complexity of the world around these individual specimens, and he's chosen to give us these two ghostly forms against that pool of inky darkness again. So really striking as an artistic choice, as a creative choice. It's powerful to stand in front of these things. It's kind of overwhelming or spooky even to be in the presence of something like this. And Melissa has helped me to understand the phenomenon that this image documents.
Sure, beech trees convey what's known as marcescence, and that's the ability of a tree to retain its leaves for an extended period of time, even after the season has ended. Besides beech, oak trees are really great at exhibiting this trait. And you speak of ghostly structures. I love it, especially because of the sound that those dry leaves make in the winter landscape. And for as dark as this image is, when we do have snow, those leaves are just such a big pop of color that it always makes me smile to see them. Marcescence is usually displayed on understory trees, in part because they're sheltered from the winter winds, but scientists aren't quite sure why trees have this trait. Some believe that the dry leaves, which are far less nutritious than green leaves, are less attractive to deer, or like the rustling might spook deer, and so they won't nibble them, protecting the tender buds that are hidden underneath of those dry leaves. Or some people feel that it's almost like a delayed shot of fertilizer, which is my favorite theory, that the tree holds on to the leaves throughout the winter and then they don't drop until spring when the tree is actively growing and is in need of more nutrients to fuel that growth.
Fascinating. This was something I've never really picked up on until working on this exhibition and looking at it with Conservancy colleagues. And then once you see marcescence, I believe it's pronounced, you can't unsee it. You start to notice it all around you. So I was driving the daily itinerary and in November, December, and started to notice this all around. And you can imagine the artist out walking, out looking, out driving, and picking up on that extra color, that extra sound, extra visual interest, a little bit of challenge for his brush, and being called to that phenomenon that maybe not just me, maybe others have learned from looking at this landscape through the eyes of Andrew Wyeth. So I really valued that takeaway. See another tulip pods. We could say some of the same things I said about the past one. Again, we're getting to that mature palette, the severely limited number of choices, how different from the choices his father made and C. Wyeth, how different from the choices his son Jamie Wyeth is making. We have this incredible purity, refinement, unapologetic immersion in pure form with very little coloristic variation, little subtle shifting tones of blacks and grays and browns, but honing in again on just that one specimen, in this case, tulip pods. What would you say about this, Melissa?
Well, the tulip pods are really a treat to see because typically they only grow in the canopy layer of a tree. So to have them at human level is rather unique because, of course, that's the remnants of the beautiful flower that I guess we should have included a photo of because it's such a striking flower that looks like nothing else. But this is the remnants of that. And when you see signs of tulip poplars, you know that that's a tree that is more suited to warmer climates. It's a little more robust in the southern part of the country, but it certainly is native here. And as our climate warms, I think it's going to establish a stronger foothold because it does produce seed very abundantly. It does volunteer growing seedlings in the landscape. I'm constantly pulling out new baby trees that I just don't have room for from my landscape. And I think tulip poplars will start replacing some of those iconic trees that we liken to Pennsylvania, including our eastern hemlock trees and our sugar maples and our black cherries, because those all like cooler climates. And so they're going to start their march north as southern species do as well, and eventually not be found in Pennsylvania. But I was also reading an interesting study that, of course, we've heard of hardwoods and softwoods. There's a researcher who thinks that this is something in between because it does grow so quickly. If you need a tree to sprout up very quickly, plant a poplar. But they found that they're really excellent at carbon storage. And so I think that might play a role in our climate control mitigation strategies.
You're just going to make me feel more guilty about the exact same phenomenon at my home. They are the bane of my existence. They are so good at perpetuating themselves. And now you're telling me that I'm hurting our carbon storage every time I uproot the feisty little tulip poplar shoot that wants to destroy the foundation of my home. But man, they are good at perpetuating themselves. I'm looking at the tulip poplar out the window over the computer. That is a real challenge over here. But yes, they're beautiful. We love the flowers. Fascinating to see how well adapted they are to this ecosystem. Let's see. I think this might be the last. Apples on a bough. This is from a nice moment. If you've been to the exhibition, you might recall there's this one wall on the subject of apples, where he gives us this strange little isolated image of apples on a bough against a white background, very unusual. And you see Betsy's title clarifying how it fits into his work. We have on view next to it, happily, before picking, and then there's also after picking. So quite literally, cycles in the natural world. The last of those after picking has this charming inscription as a gift to his mother. So these beautiful little still lifes kind of apples still attached to their the bough in which they grew, and those rosy hues. How nice to get a little bit of red after all these monochrome, really monk-like watercolors, where he gives himself so few options and immerses ourselves in this cold, hard, wintry landscape. What would you say about this, Melissa?
Well, here to the use of color. Red is one of my favorite colors. And I'm smiling because yesterday when I was at Penguin Court, I went down to our apple orchards. We have a pretty extensive one because I wanted to get a real life photo to compare to the painting. And virtually every apple that could be on the tree was gone because we have a lot of deer and raccoons and bears that utilize them for food. And so I was able to capture one photo of a cluster of apples. But I think apple trees are one of the indicative signs of spring. When the apple trees are in bloom, that winter is behind us for the most part. Climate change, of course, is giving us some changes in our seasons. And I know it was last year that the state of Georgia had a really abysmal peach crop because their peach trees had blossomed and then they got a hard frost and that killed a lot of the flowers. And the same thing has happened before to our apple trees at Penguin Court, I'm sure out in Chadds Ford and even up in Maine. And this is all important because phenology is the study of seasonal and cyclic changes in nature, from the migrations of birds to the flowering and leafing out of trees. And what we're concerned about is that as our winters warm, trees will get tricked into budding and flowering sooner, but then we might get a cold snap as Georgia had, and that's going to really harm their growth and reproductive strategies. Also, climate change can be affecting our crops, which has economic impacts and impacts on just our traditions, our livelihoods. Sugar maples might be producing far earlier than they've ever been tapped before, and farmers might miss that season. And so it's really important as citizen scientists to make observations that you can fuel into databases. iNaturalist is one of my favorites. You can easily download the iNaturalist app to your phone, or you can use it as a web application. You do not need to necessarily have it on your phone, but you can create a free account, go out and take photographs of plants in their different stages, upload that image as well as the data, your location, the date, the time, and scientists from all over the world can pull that information together and see how the seasons are progressing across the country and across the continent. And that's really valuable because we're afraid that the synchronicity of the flowering of plants might not align with the return of birds. For example, hummingbirds, they come back in late spring when columbine, spring ephemeral, is typically blooming. But, there's those two paths could easily diverge, and that could have unknown consequences to our wildlife.
I really like that note as one to end on. We could go on through so many images in this exhibition. There's so many layers. We do hope that people will come in and see them for themselves. But that note of citizen science, I'm thinking about how the Wyeths inhabited their twin worlds, the world of Chadds Ford and the world of Mid-Coast Maine. These again, narrowly circumscribed regions that were enough for a lifetime, that they came to know deeply, that they did comment on and understand, if not as scientists, as naturalists, people who are living with the natural world and writing about it, thinking about it, making about it in the way that Henry David Thoreau did in the book that gave us the title of our exhibition. In Thoreau's Walden, he uses the phrase "every leaf and twig" as he's observing the world around him. I'm thinking also about how Betsy Wyeth Wyeth was tracking bird life and engaged with archaeological science and trying to bring some rigor to observations of the world around them, maybe especially in the islands in Maine that she transformed that have been a great research interest for us in the Wyeth Study Center. So we should all think about that. I hope that at minimum you will notice some of these phenomena, these plants as you walk the trails of the Brandywine Conservancy, as you explore the Laurels Preserve, and maybe even as you go up to the other half of Wyeth's life, think about those the coast, the maritime spruce fir forest that called out to him there, and imagine this sensitive inhabitant of the natural world at work. So we can open up to questions. I will stop screen sharing. I see just some nice comments so far. One I can take, and please do feel free to add others. And now I realize how dark I have been for this whole thing, so I'm turning on my light here. One question that we get a lot is you've tantalized us with all these great things in the Wyeth Study Center, and a chance we can get in there and have a look see. The Wyeth Study Center is open by appointment only. We're a pretty small team. It is wholly possible that we might do some member viewing, but it would have to be pretty small. We can only really accommodate about 15 to 20 people at a time. But we will do our utmost to make this less of a well-kept secret. Behind the scenes, there is a lot of time and energy going into digitizing the full Andrew and Betsy Wyeth collection. There is every hope that by next year, not as soon as I would have liked, but next year, we will be able to publish a significant portion of this collection from which these exhibitions are drawn in what we call an e-museum, a web collection online system. So you will be able to browse for yourself digitally at least, and then we will certainly keep on doing continuously in the Andrew Wyeth Gallery in Chadds Ford and the Hadlock and Wyeth Study Center galleries at the Farnsworth, exhibitions drawn from this collection, and we'll certainly try to create some opportunities to get folks into these spaces and share what we're working with. I have a question from my wife. Did Wyeth read about or study botany? That's an interesting question. We certainly have the books of the Wyeth family preserved in the Wyeth Study Center library. We have the mill library, as we call it, the books that Andrew and Betsy Wyeth worked with in that property just up the road from the Brandywine, about which we're thinking these days, hoping someday to give some form of public access to that site. Not so much botanical science, but certainly that larger theme of naturalism. Thoreau is a lodestar for sure, but many other writers about nature pop up in the collection. The question is, where does Andrew Wyeth end and Betsy Wyeth begin? We don't know exactly who was reading what, but there is evidence in the library of thoughtful people trying to understand the world around them, for sure. Let's see. I don't see any other questions. Thank you for the nice comments. I'm glad you enjoyed those. Did he make his own paints? In tempera, to a certain extent, yes, but mostly what we're talking about here with watercolor are manufactured pigments that he's working with. So yeah, we still have, it's fascinating to work with that mill library that I mentioned, and you'll be flipping through a book in the collection, and then oops, what pops out but a period catalog of some watercolor manufacturer that he used as a bookmark that day, and you get a sense of where he was getting his pigments there. Those are all the questions. Glad you enjoyed the connection between art and ecology. We're doing our best to show what's possible in the Brandywine Conservancy and Museum of Art, and we'll hope to do more collaborations of this kind. A lot of museums, as I mentioned, are thinking in this way, and we are very fortunate as the museum that is kind of mecca for Wyeth studies to be able to tell the story of this artist through the lens of environmental change, somebody who was always already aware of the cycles in the natural world around him. Another Will writes in with the repeated flooding of the Brandywine, how will the museum be able to continue in this location? And you'll be hearing more about that in the future. There's a lot of work going on behind the scenes at the Brandywine Museum of Art to prepare for the future. Flood hardening happening to our legacy building, our beloved Hoffman's Mill. And plans are in the works for buildings that will really secure the future of the organization. So that building we know and love will be secured for the future. future for many years to come. In short, yes, but that's not where the thought ends. And again, we're so fortunate to have people like Melissa within our own organization, so we can think hard about what we need to be ready for in the future. So if you see construction around the Brandywine, bear with us. It's all about being ready for that future. Was Andrew aware of Martin Johnson Head? Yes. I'm now remembering in the Mill Library books on Head's work. What I was just pausing to reflect on is I was just talking with my team in the Wyeth Study Center about this earlier today. I keep on getting my mind blown and would like to stop getting my mind blown by having a comprehensive list of the paintings that Andrew Wyeth collected and owned with Betsy. They may have even owned a Head at some point. I can't prove it, but I will work on getting on top of that. I shared that artist name in the Q&A earlier. Melissa planted that seed in the way she was talking about wetlands earlier in this conversation. That was a spontaneous reflection. I wish that I'd included a Head in the PowerPoint here. I think this is a larger mission for us at the Brandywine. We risk thinking about this story of our landscape, our region in isolation from wider cultural cross currents. And every day we're finding more and more evidence of just how interconnected this creative legacy is with contemporary artists in the big city, and indeed with historic art, both American and international, as well as indigenous art. And that's a whole fascinating story. So I'm certain he was aware of Head, and he may have even owned a Head. So we'll have to dig into that. Question answered. Glad you enjoyed. Glad you saw the Farnsworth part of the exhibition. Yeah, Wyeth's paintings as a tool for research on this region. I hope that they will become a useful reference. There's some interesting work happening in Maine, as you alluded. We're not just the Farnsworth, but also some other institutions up there are looking at art history as a way to understand changes in the land as a tool for research. So yeah, we'll hope to see more of that in this region. I know I'm doing a lot of talking here because I felt like a lot of the questions were more on the art side, but anything you'd want to say about any of these questions? I hope you can see all of that as well, Melissa.
No, I can see them, and I appreciate the kind comments from everyone. I too am excited for these collaborations, and I hope we get to do this more in the future.
Excellent. All right, so it looks like that is the end of our questions. Thank you all so much for joining us. We will have another program for our next Andrew Wyeth exhibition, as I mentioned, up east, Andrew Wyeth in Maine on October 1st. And we will always have more good things happening, so please stay tuned. If you're not a member already, please consider joining. Thanks very much for spending your evening with us. And thank you, Melissa.
Sure. Good night.